The title is the topic. Today I'm going to review the feminist frequency video Women as Reward. As I've done previously, I'll start with the resources first. First thing I'll note is there is no catalog of games as she had with the damsel in distress. There are also no real resources like she had in previous videos. I'll just have to see what she says in the video itself. She referenced 50 games, which is definitely better than some of her other videos. Given the context of the statement she made in her initial video, though,
this project will examine the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
Even 50 games isn't much when you look at the industry as a whole. I also like that this doesn't look like it's intended as a multi-part series. However, she did have the special DLC mini-episode, so whatever. It is what it is. Having said that, let's get on with the review.
As always, remember that it's both possible and even necessary to be critical of the media we enjoy. That's going to be especially important to keep in mind given the video game franchise we're about to discuss.
As always, remember, Anita thinks it's possible and even necessary to be critical of the media we enjoy. That's especially important for Anita's supporters to keep in mind given the video series I'm about to discuss.
In 1987, Nintendo released a 2D action-adventure game for their Nintendo Entertainment System, which departed from traditional video game conventions.
Anita says quite a bit about Metroid that I don't have much issue with. A lot of it is description of the game and such, so I'll be cutting some of that out to keep the review shorter. You can always watch the original video if you want to see the whole thing.
Sadly, the alternate endings did not stop there. The two best endings make Metroid one of the first games to exploit the women as reward trope, as both reveal Samus in various states of undress. The better a player does, the more clothing is removed. If the player completes the game in under 3 hours, Samus is shown without her armor and in a leotard. If the player finishes in under 1 hour, they're treated to Samus in a bikini.
Which is something that is a little odd considering the nature of the game. This is one of the points I wouldn't entirely disagree with Anita on.
So yes, Samus wasn't a damseled woman waiting at the end of the game as a trophy, rather her body itself became the prize awarded to players for a job well done. Later games in the Metroid series continued the convention of rewarding players with endings featuring Samus in various states of undress.
I want to go back to something she said a bit ago.
This was a significant moment in gaming history, especially for many female gaming fans, because at the time, nearly all protagonists were just assumed to be male by default.
Sometimes people like something they can relate to. It's not rare for a girl to look up to a woman in a movie when it's a respectable character, and given this game was most likely designed with the intent of children playing, it probably could have done without the bikini. This actually is something I think would be worth discussing.
In one sense, Samus Aran definitely did subvert traditional gender tropes of the 1980s by taking on the role of intrepid hero. However, she and her body were still presented to players as prizes to be won.
Anita did mention disrupting the established pattern in her damsel in distress videos, but she also emphasized that a role reversal doesn't solve the problem. I guess when it comes to lead protagonists, it's fine to reverse the roles, but a damseled man that requires rescuing doesn't solve the problem.
The convention of earning access to cutscenes or ending vignettes with eroticized female bodies can be found in many titles over the past 30 years.
These aren't lead female protagonists like Samus, so the context changes somewhat. Some of these are also racing games and mature titles, while some of them aren't. There's a lot more that needs to be discussed here.
We can trace the roots of the women as reward trope all the way back to the beginnings of the medium itself. As we discussed in our Damsel in Distress miniseries, upon successful completion of many arcade games, players were rewarded with the related Smooch of Victory trope, so named for the kiss the hero received as a reward for rescuing a kidnapped princess.
As I recall in your Damsel in Distress video, you made it crystal clear these were separate tropes.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself.
Yet now you are talking about these associated conventions in relation to the damsel in distress trope.
Sometimes the prize is blatant, as with the standard hero reward, in which a king will give his daughter to the hero. On other occasions, it's taken a step further by employing the parallel sex of victory or rescue sex trope. Yes, it's exactly what you think it is. Instead of a kiss, sex with the rescued victim is the player's reward.
So let's go back and apply your arguments to this trope.
Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the women as reward trope is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the damsel in distress. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the women as reward trope itself.
I suspected when you mentioned this video in your Kickstarter update you would go back to the damsel in distress trope, even though you already defined it as not part of the trope itself. I planned this response well in advance. I'm so far ahead of you that my counter-argument was ready before you even began producing this video.
Studied extensively.
It's like I've said in the past, you pick and choose what does and doesn't count at your leisure, and even at that, I can still counter your arguments within the confines of your ridiculous set of rules.
We've coined the women as reward trope to describe a long-running pattern found in interactive media. It occurs when women, or more often women's bodies, are employed as rewards for player actions in video games. The trope frames female bodies as collectible, as tractable, or as consumable, and positions women as status symbols designed to validate the masculinity of presumed straight male players.
Whether it's aimed at presumed straight male players is debatable depending on the nature of how the trope is used. I don't think all women as reward tropes are aimed specifically at straight men.
There's some overlap between the damsel in distress and women as reward, but they function differently. While the damsel in distress trope uses women as a plot device to motivate male heroes, the women as reward trope presents women as a formalized reward mechanism, meaning that the reward is coded into the game system itself. The result of this incentive structure is that access to women's bodies, women's affection, or women's sexuality is reduced to a simple equation that guarantees delivery as long as the correct set of inputs are entered into the system.
Although there's a lot of technically Anita is right, you still have yet to provide enough evidence to convince me this is inherently harmful in video games.
In this way, the women as reward trope helps foster a sense of entitlement, where players are encouraged to view women as something they've earned the right to by virtue of their gaming actions, skills, or accomplishments. This is illustrated in arcade classics like Joe and Mac and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. After players save the damsel in both games, she will bestow a kiss on the character who earned the most points on that stage.
So you're mentioning damsels again, even though you reinforce these are separate tropes, but setting that technicality aside, you said for earning the most points on that stage. I'd argue this being an issue is debatable.
Entitlement to women is made even more explicit in many versions of Double Dragon. At the end of the game, after the final boss has been defeated and the damsel in distress saved, Player 1 and Player 2 must fight each other over who gets to have Marion, and with her, the smooch of victory.
As opposed to less explicit in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Your attempt to frame it as worse in some games reinforces it isn't as bad in others.
Studied extensively.
This is beginning to come off as another attack the trope from every angle possible, so the only way it is acceptable is to eliminate it in its traditional form. Or I could say it's just another standard episode of tropes versus women in video games.
Notice that Marion's desires are not part of the equation. She has no say in the matter. She simply fills the role of a trophy for whichever player is ultimately victorious.
I find it odd that you talk about her desires as a character because on Twitter your co-writer Jonathan McIntosh said this about Cammy from Street Fighter. For the millionth time, Cammy doesn't want anything. Her designers put her into a thong leotard to appeal to dudes. Once again, Cammy is fictional. She doesn't want anything. Her designers make all the choices about her character. If Cammy is fictional and doesn't want anything, then why does it matter what Marion's desires are and what her say in the matter is?
Notice that Marion's desires are not part of the equation. She has no say in the matter.
Your own writer for Tropes vs. Women in video games says what they want does not matter because they are fictional characters that don't want anything.
This scene serves as inspiration for similar scenarios in more contemporary games like Castle Crashers.
Fictional characters whose desires do not matter as what they want does not matter.
We've identified 6 primary ways the women as reward trope manifests in video games. Over the course of this episode, we will examine each in turn. In addition to the earned cinematics we've already discussed, we will cover the trope as it relates to Easter eggs, unlockable costumes, experience points, collectibles, and achievements.
Looking at this list, I'd agree that cinematics aren't nearly as optional as the rest. However, a lot of these look like choices to undertake, making it less of an issue in the big picture.
Easter eggs are intentionally hidden secrets or jokes which developers conceal inside of their games. Like the eggs at a children's Easter egg hunt, these secrets are usually difficult to find, but are meant to be discovered as rewards for particularly industrious gamers. Easter eggs can be hidden messages, items, secret characters, or random events, and their inclusion encourages experimentation with the game's systems and mechanics in order to uncover these extra treasures.
No issues with the description.
Some can be found inside game environments, while others require a cheat code to unlock. For example, if players input a specific button sequence while starting up the 1991 role-playing game Rings of Power, the title screen would change. By pressing down, right, A, B, C, and the start button, players were rewarded with an image of a topless woman next to the Naughty Dog logo.
I'm not sure what to say about that one. I would probably say it wasn't necessary in that particular game.
Easter eggs are, of course, not inherently problematic, and gaming history is filled with examples of neat secrets that designers have hidden away for players to discover. But too frequently, Easter eggs are used as another way to reward players with women's bodies.
You started that section with "they are not inherently problematic."
Easter eggs are, of course, not inherently problematic.
You are the one who is defining what is and is not problematic without any discussion or dissenting voice. You are not a moral authority, just a pop culture critic.
Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4 included a secret unlockable character named Daisy, who bore the likeness of porn star Jenna Jameson.
She also provided the voice of Daisy. This character is meant to be like Jenna Jameson.
Daisy's sexualized appearance and skateboard tricks are designed as a reward for those players who unlocked her.
I think whether this is acceptable or not is debatable. It's an unlockable Easter egg after all.
One way to do that is by entering this code.
Alright, the code is a little perverted considering teenagers and such will be playing this. Then again, that argument could be applied to Daisy as well. I'll just leave it at it's worth discussing.
Probably one of the most famous women as reward Easter eggs brings us back to Samus Aran. The original Metroid used a password system to save progress. By inputting the secret code Justin Bailey into this system, gamers would unlock a powered-up playable version of Samus wearing only her leotard-style bathing suit. Incidentally, this is the same outfit we covered earlier as an endgame reward. Only here she has the powers of the Varia suit and its associated color palette swap, which changes her hair color to green. Players can then play the entire game as Samus without her space armor, so she ends up exploring a hostile alien world and fighting off deadly monsters in her underwear.
As I said in the beginning, I wouldn't completely disagree with Anita on everything when it comes to Samus.
There's a bizarre Easter egg in the original Ratchet & Clank. If the player does a series of side flips in front of a green-skinned alien, the woman's breasts will suddenly begin to inflate. The more gymnastic stunts performed, the larger her boobs will become.
Honestly, some of this stuff is so stupid I can't help but laugh at it. I'm having a hard time taking this one serious. However, I can't disagree entirely with people requesting developers to consider which games this sort of stuff should be in.
There are so many women as reward style Easter eggs in the Metal Gear Solid series that it would take several hours to go over them all.
However, now we're talking about mature titles. The Metal Gear games are made by a developer called Kojima. This is from a tweet he made back in 2013. Egg Benedict. Looks like boobies when shaking the plate. LOL. He has a sense of humor about sexuality that bothers some people and others not so much. However, your co-writer and producer Jonathan McIntosh has referenced this tweet made by Kojima multiple times over the last year. Behold, the very mature visionary behind very mature video game maturity. Reminder, this is the man many gamers consider to be a genius of mature storytelling. It's not just an immature boy's joke, it's also Kojima's idea of character development for many women in his games. And then this response to someone talking about devs using fictional character empowerment as cover for wank fantasies. Cough. Kojima and quiet. Cough. You are about to go into a deconstruction of the portrayals of women in Kojima's games. Given your producer's infatuation with shaming Kojima, I'm not fond of how your organization, Feminist Frequency, goes about critiquing people outside of your videos. McIntosh is an employee of yours.
After the unexpected success of my 2012 Kickstarter campaign, I hired a co-writer and producer to help work on the new Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series. My newly employed producer, Jonathan McIntosh.
Since Jonathan McIntosh is your employee, I might suggest you have a little conversation with him about his conduct on Twitter. It reflects on your organization. This is especially problematic considering he is also a writer on your videos.
Studied extensively.
Now I'm going to let this entire section play out before I give any more commentary.
First released for the PlayStation in 1998, and then remade for the GameCube in 2004, Metal Gear Solid featured not one, but two separate Easter eggs that allow players to see Meryl Silverberg in her underwear. The second of these Easter eggs requires players to follow Meryl into the ladies' room and interrupt her while she's changing. If this is done quickly enough, the next cutscene will play with Meryl in her underwear.
Anyway, how did you recognize me in disguise?
I never forget a lady.
Jumping ahead to the fourth game, the protagonist is assigned a psychologist for PTSD counseling. During these remote sessions, if players shake their PlayStation controller, the psychologist's breasts will bounce and jiggle in response.
Memories began to resurface from his childhood when he fought for Solidus in the Liberian Civil War.
Keep in mind that Easter eggs are not accidents or glitches. They're intentionally put into the game by the designers, and as a result indicate the value that the designers themselves place on these female characters. They communicate to players that yes, these women exist for players to exploit or experiment with for their own amusement.
You're entitled to your opinions just as Kojima is entitled to do as he pleases with his games. It's ultimately his choice whether to take your critiques into consideration. Macintosh repeatedly shaming him on Twitter is problematic in my opinion. It's up to you whether you want to accept my critique of your producer or not.
Unlockable outfits are additional costumes earned during gameplay, which allow gamers to play dress-up with player characters or party members. Alternative skins, as they're sometimes called, come in all shapes and sizes, and are typically just cosmetic changes to the character's appearance, although sometimes they add special abilities. Many unlockable costumes are cool, wacky, or bizarre.
That sounds nice.
But when applied to female characters, we see a distinct pattern of revealing, hypersexualized outfits.
I hate to sound like a broken record, but you are the one defining this as an issue. These are unlockable outfits and costumes. They are optional, not required.
Fetishized bunny, cat, maid, or nurse costumes are commonly used by developers as a way to pander to an assumed straight male player base.
So what if they're aimed at straight male players? A lot of this stuff is not mandatory. I could understand if this stuff wasn't optional, but you're talking about a lot of optional things.
It's important to remember that sexualization is not necessarily just about the amount of skin showing, but is instead connected to the question of whether or not a costume is eroticized for the express purpose of titillation.
Was Samus's bonus outfit eroticized with the express purpose of titillation, or does it just show more skin? Your critiques have so many technicalities, I'd be frustrated if I were a game developer that tried to follow your checklist.
These types of unlockable outfits can be especially pernicious since they often end up undermining women who are otherwise appropriately dressed for active or professional roles.
Since your producer defines them as fictional characters that don't want anything, I don't think it bothers them that much if they aren't appropriately dressed.
The Resident Evil franchise has been particularly guilty of this over the years. Almost every major release in the series has included the women as reward trope. Resident Evil is a bit unusual in that since its beginnings in the mid-90s, the franchise has featured a large number of playable female protagonists, most of whom are skilled zombie fighters and have impressive professional resumes, to say the least.
So even if Resident Evil does more to feature female protagonists than other franchises, it's still problematic if they have this optional trope.
Studied extensively.
I'm gonna let this entire section play through. It's a bit over 1 minute long, so bear with me.
Rebecca Chambers is a police officer and medic in the Special Tactics and Rescue Service. Players can dress her up in sexy nurse and cheerleader costumes. Jill Valentine is a high-ranking Special Operations Agent in the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, and also the Master of Unlocking. She can be placed in sexy policewoman and sexy pirate outfits. Claire Redfield is a member of a human rights organization that provides aid during bioterrorism incidents. She can be turned into a motorsport umbrella girl. Sherry Birkin is a U.S. government agent working with the Division of Security Operations, and here she's wearing a schoolgirl outfit. Helena Harper is a Secret Service agent and a former member of the CIA. Her unlockable costumes include another sexy policewoman, complete with miniskirt and garter belt. Shiva Alamar is an agent for the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, operating in the West African branch. The tribal print bikini outfit is especially disconcerting because it combines the sexualization of a female character with the racist tradition of exotifying women of color, particularly women of African ancestry. More on that topic in an upcoming video.
If those are the only optional outfits, you might have a point. If those are not the only ones, then it's debatable. And looking through the ESRB website, it seems most of the Resident Evil games are mature titles. I think once we enter the realm of games that are intended for an adult or more mature audience, we should be more considerate about what is or isn't problematic.
As a reward for completing the main game under specific conditions, players gain the ability to shove these female police and special agents into the digital equivalent of those patronizing sexy Halloween costumes we see mass-produced every year.
Players can push their characters into the same sexy outfits women in the real world willingly push themselves into. You'd almost think that special sexy outfits in games reflect special sexy outfits in the real world for a reason you already explained.
Because it's a reflection of our society.
These games reflect society. So if they imitate something in the real world, you'd almost have to minimize its use in the real world to minimize its use in video games.
These ensembles are not only completely inappropriate for the mission at hand, but also reduce otherwise capable characters to sexual objects for the voyeuristic enjoyment of players.
These are fictional characters without feelings. In video games, it doesn't matter if an outfit is functional, it's there for looks. These outfits are optional after you complete the game. Even if a player enjoys it, no real women were objectified, just fictional characters. These may not even be all their optional outfits. It isn't as big a deal when you look at all the factors.
The latest game in the series, 2015's Resident Evil Revelations 2, continues this condescending tradition by offering DLC that puts Claire Redfield into a sexualized cowgirl outfit and forces Moira into whatever the hell this is supposed to be. The developers call it an urban ninja costume.
A condescending tradition? But Anita...
Despite these troubling implications, game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy. The latest game in the series, 2015's Resident Evil Revelations 2, continues this condescending tradition. Meanwhile, the male playable character Barry gets a gentleman's commandant alternative costume.
I'd say give the guys more sexy outfits, but role reversals don't solve the problem. I'd say give the women more functional looking or tough looking outfits, but role reversals don't solve the problem. Your only solution then would be to get rid of optional sexy outfits altogether.
Studied extensively.
That's just how you roll.
Alternative costumes for men are rarely objectifying. They're instead presented as tough guy power fantasies for other straight men to identify with.
I notice how you keep criticizing things presumably aimed at straight men. Why do your videos keep attacking things that specifically have to do with straight men? What's the point in vilifying an entire demographic if this is just about better representations? Why should what straight men may want be so heavily criticized?
And when men are stripped down to their beachwear, it's most often meant as a lighthearted joke.
So when they do that to men, it's a lighthearted joke, but when they put silly outfits on a girl, it's inappropriate for the mission at hand.
These ensembles are not only completely inappropriate for the mission at hand.
Couldn't the same be said about optional outfits for men?
These ensembles are not only completely inappropriate for the mission at hand.
You apply certain arguments to one gender while excluding them from the other. As far as it being a lighthearted joke, couldn't the same be said about the sexy outfits?
It's most often meant as a lighthearted joke.
All I have to do is switch things around, and it actually sounds like you're talking about the other gender.
Studied extensively.
You have serious issues with double standards when it comes to gender representation in games.
Shifting to an example of a game that does alternative female costumes right, Alice Madness Returns features a wide assortment of imaginative, unlockable dresses. And if you must go the bunny girl or cat girl route, this right here is definitely the way to do it.
I don't have much issue with what you said there. It's nice to see you pointing out something you perceive to be a positive once in a while. Examples like this are better at offering a solution rather than straight up criticism.
In many games, experience points or XP are earned by completing tasks like defeating monsters or finishing quests. Once enough experience points have been accumulated, player characters can periodically level up, making them stronger or giving them access to new abilities. Unfortunately, designers sometimes tie the awarding of experience points directly to sexual interactions with female characters, effectively transforming women into conduits which players can utilize to become more powerful warriors.
Sometimes. So let's see where this goes.
In the 2007 game Conan, for example, dozens of half-naked maidens are chained up throughout the game.
Take me and crush me with your love.
When rescued, they essentially function as sexualized treasure chests, rewarding the player with experience points. which are then used to unlock more powerful fighting moves. A number of other games tie experience points directly to sex. The God of War games, for instance, established a tradition of including mini-games that reward the player for successfully having sex with one or more women. Completing these little quick-time events earn players red orbs that are used to upgrade attacks and magic. Beginning with the third game, the Grand Theft Auto series allows players to buy sex from prostitutes,
Get in the car.
and rewards them by restoring their health meter. In Grand Theft Auto 5, players are given additional encouragement to solicit prostitutes in the form of an increase to their character's stamina rating, which enables those characters to sprint, swim, or ride a bike faster for longer periods of time. Similarly, in The Witcher 3, Geralt earns a handful of experience points for buying sex from prostitutes, and he earns more points for sex with the courtesans in the wealthier districts than with the strumpets in the poor parts of the city.
I noticed you're recycling games from women as background decoration. Is it possible that maybe, just maybe, some of this stuff is limited to a handful of games within the industry? Not many games have sex scenes this intimate, and being you can find this material in almost all other forms of media, should it be off limits in video games?
When women are used as sexualized experience point dispensers, the sexual scenarios are themselves a reward designed to validate the masculinity of presumed straight male players. But there's a dual reward here. Absorbing these expressions of female sexuality carries with it the ability for male characters to grow stronger, faster, and more capable, reducing the women to points in a mathematical equation that directly links the flippant consumption of female sexuality to an increase in male power.
No, it doesn't validate the masculinity of the player, it gives the character experience points and makes them power up. As far as linking sexuality to male power, you can make equally compelling arguments for anything in a game that makes a male character more powerful. An example would be, see that human enemy over there? Killing it makes your character more powerful. That directly links the act of killing another human being to an increase in male power. It conveys very toxic ideas about masculinity where you have to use violence to make progress. This is why violence as a primary form of engagement is problematic. The logic feminist frequency uses in their videos could be used to justify the elimination of anything in a game that is deemed unacceptable. Your language is a lot more manipulative than people understand.
Note that while the consumption of women makes male characters more powerful, it has nothing to do with mutual relationship building. The relationship, such as it is, ends with sex, or rescuing the woman. At that point, she has served her purpose. Players have reaped the benefits, and her value has been depleted.
She served her purpose for reasons you outlined in Women as Background Decoration.
In gaming lingo, the secondary characters populating the virtual environments are referred to as NPCs, short for non-player characters or non-playable characters. These are figures not directly controlled by the player, and whose behaviors and dialogue are governed by automated scripts within the game's code.
They are scripted that way. Developers don't waste that much time and resources on most NPCs.
Like an empty energy drink container, she is simply cast aside after being consumed.
It's like Macintosh said about Cammy. These are fictional characters that don't want anything. They don't care if they are cast aside or your character has a meaningful relationship with them, because even if they did, it was scripted that way.
That's hardly the only problem with female NPCs who are designed to function as sexually objectified set dressing. For more on the myriad of issues with these types of characters, see our 2 videos on the women as background decoration trope.
Your background decoration video had a myriad of issues I covered in my reviews.
Collectibles are virtual items placed or hidden throughout a game world for players to find. Some collectible objects have effects on gameplay, such as boosting player stats or serving as score multipliers. Other collectibles are designed simply to be accumulated to provide a sense of accomplishment. Once acquired, some collectibles unlocked concept art or other media fragments that can be viewed later in galleries selected from the game's menu screen. When done well, collectibles inspire exploration and replayability. However, when they're designed to function as an extension of the women as reward trope, players are encouraged to view women's bodies as souvenirs of their adventures.
And we're back into the territory of debatable. I think it depends on the game, but that's just my opinion.
In the 2010 remake of Splatterhouse, players are encouraged to collect ripped-up pieces of photographs of the protagonist's girlfriend, which are strewn around each level. Once the player pieces them together, the completed images consist mostly of private, personal sexual photos.
Does that make it an object that objectifies a fictional woman within a fictional world?
Sometimes the women as reward trope takes the form of corporate-branded product placement. For instance, 2K Games officially partnered with Playboy to include 50 hidden magazines scattered throughout Mafia 2's open-world environment. Once found, each collectible opens to reveal vintage centerfolds from real 1950s Playboy issues. The discovered magazines are then stored in the game's inventory and are available to be perused at the player's whim.
It's a problem because they partnered with Playboy so you could find Playboy magazines within the game.
Studied extensively.
And you are being rewarded with an object that objectifies women. It's not even the characters themselves anymore. I know what I say undermines your point, but your point is getting difficult to take serious.
Konami's Metal Gear Solid series took this trend a step further by actually turning pornography into a weapon. In Metal Gear Solid 4, there are Playboy magazines scattered throughout the game world for players to find. When acquired, the magazines are stored in the game's weapons inventory, alongside rifles and handguns, and serve a dual purpose. Players can look through the images at their leisure, and also use them to set traps by laying the centerfolds open on the battlefield to distract enemies.
Ooh, what's this?
I think this is meant as a lighthearted joke.
It's most often meant as a lighthearted joke.
Your rules change depending on the subject at hand. One minute these things reinforce regressive notions, the next they're lighthearted jokes.
In the first Witcher game, players are awarded romance cards for successfully seducing each of over 24 different non-playable female characters.
The Witcher, Metal Gear Solid, you keep coming back to these games. These tropes that are supposed to be so widespread keep revolving around the same games. You'd almost think that this isn't as big a deal as you lead people to believe.
Like other examples we've talked about, these pornographic collectibles are saved in the player's inventory and are available to be ogled at any time. The souvenirs function as a private trophy collection, encouraging players to view these female characters as sexual conquest, and acquire as many different flavors of women as possible during their playthrough.
We have objects that objectify fictional women in some games. I don't think it's mandatory to get these cards. These are mature titles. It's just sounding like more of your get rid of it mentality.
If collectibles in the player's inventory work as a private trophy collection, then achievements serve as a public trophy case, on display for all to see. Achievements, or trophies, are meta-goal award systems built into most popular gaming platforms. Unlike collectibles, achievements are earned through in-game actions, but awarded outside of the game environment itself and have no effect on gameplay. Some achievements are rewarded for skill or completion of tasks, while others are arbitrary challenges set up by developers. These systems encourage replayability and provide players with incentives to spend more time inside the game space, experimenting with its environments and characters. By default, your achievements are visible to anyone who views your profile on a gaming platform, and thus they allow players to show off their gaming skill or dedication to their friends. In other words, achievements are designed to function as status symbols for gamers.
So here comes how getting achievements involving women is a status symbol of sexism and misogyny.
A whole host of games reward players with trophies for successfully having sex with one or more female characters. A suspicious number of those achievements are called Ladies' Man.
A suspicious number of games look familiar here. God of War, The Witcher, God of War, Grand Theft Auto, God of War, Grand Theft Auto, God of War.
A trope is a common pattern in a story or a recognizable attribute in a character that conveys information to the audience. A trope becomes a cliché when it's overused.
Anita's repeated use of the same games over and over across multiple videos has itself become a trope in a series of videos about tropes.
Studied extensively. Other games in the God of War series use a variety of euphemistic naming schemes for this. In the PS3 version of the original game, the trophy's titled Rockin' the Boat. In Ghosts of Sparta, players receive the A Hero's Welcome trophy, and in Chains of Olympus, the award is called 2 Girls, 1 Spartan.
Oh, Nico, I really like you.
Some games in the Grand Theft Auto series offer achievements for betting a girlfriend.
I think she likes me.
Just so we're clear on what's happening here, players are receiving a literal trophy for achieving sex with a woman. When games such as these award players with achievements or trophies for sexual conquests, they're directly reinforcing negative ways of thinking about the dynamics between men and women in our society.
Just so we're clear what's happening here, players are receiving a fictional trophy for achieving fake sex with a fictional woman. These are mature titles, and this only exists in some games. Even if it reinforced negative ways of thinking, which is debatable, it isn't a systemic big picture issue.
By presenting sex as an end goal of men's interactions or relationships with women, these games frame sexual encounters as challenges to be overcome. Let me emphasize that the problem here is not necessarily that sex is included in these games. By presenting sex as a goal and then presenting players with an award for accomplishing that goal, these achievements function as a form of trophyism. Simply put, trophyism is the tendency for men to view women as objects to be collected and displayed as status symbols of their sexual prowess or virility. These trophy women then serve as a way for men to assert their social status among and relative to other men.
These are achievements in video games. I don't think you provide enough evidence that this notion of treating women like a trophy in a game has any significant carryover to the real world.
The fame point system in the 2004 version of Sid Meier's Pirates provides us with a stark illustration of trophyism. In the game, romancing and then rescuing any of the game's many governors' daughters not only rewards your pirate with the option to marry her, but also wins him extra fame points.
I might feel sorry for these characters if they weren't fictional or actually wanted things. I think they're just there for the story. Is it really that bad to have games once in a while where you rescue a woman? These would be considered damsels, wouldn't they?
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance.
But since these damsels fall within the criteria of what Anita thinks is problematic, I don't know what else to say.
The daughters are largely interchangeable. They don't even have names, and their value as a reward is tied directly to their appearance. Courting and marrying a plain daughter earned fewer fame points than marrying an attractive one, and marrying a beautiful daughter earns the most points of all.
They're interchangeable because they are scripted NPCs. To give every NPC in a game a fleshed out identity would be a ridiculous undertaking for most game developers. As for their appearance, that is a reflection of society. If you want women to stop being valued for their looks in games, you have to change that in the real world. Even then, you may never completely get rid of what a straight man does and doesn't find attractive, which is what it seems like you're trying to do in these videos. Criticize the preferences of most straight men.
Fame points then directly contribute to the social status your character achieves at the end of the game. Depending on the amount of points accrued, you could end up as anything from a lowly pauper to a powerful governor.
Shouldn't you take issue with the possibility of ending up as a lowly pauper? What a tragedy that a man could end up like that in a game.
Other ways to earn fame points include acquiring wealth and defeating rivals. Like all your swashbuckling escapades, acquiring a woman becomes just another feather in your proverbial cap, functioning to elevate your prestige and renown in society.
Defeating rivals is also another feather in your proverbial cap. The idea of a man having to defeat another man in a game to progress is troublesome. It's even more problematic if the dispute is eventually solved with violence, especially if violence is the primary form of engagement.
And since in the game's Xbox Live Arcade release there are achievements for getting married and for courting governors' daughters from all 4 nations at once, these accomplishments also increase your gaming status.
The question I have is, are there achievements for killing men in this game? It would be a shame if violence against male characters was reduced to the status of an achievement. I wonder if Macintosh is writing down anything I'm saying to use in your planned video series about representations of men and masculinity in video games.
Achievements on Sony PlayStation platforms are called trophies, but back when they were first introduced, they were called entitlements, which is a fitting name for those that fall into the women as reward trope. Since entitlement, or more specifically male entitlement, is the crux of much of what we've been discussing in this video, let's take a moment to define what male entitlement actually means.
Male entitlement is a crux of this video, as in this video was about criticizing straight male preferences. You frame it so what straight men prefer is somehow toxic in nature.
First, the word entitlement refers to the conviction that someone deserves something, that they're owed it, that they have a right to it. By extension, male entitlement is the conviction that men are owed something by virtue of their gender. It's the belief structure that tells men they deserve to have their whims catered to, both culturally and interpersonally. One of the most harmful aspects of male entitlement is the false belief that men have a right to survey and use women's bodies.
Feminist entitlement. Feminist entitlement is the conviction that women are owed something by virtue of their gender. It is the belief structure that tells women they are allowed to lie and manipulate as long as it furthers the narrative. One of the most harmful aspects of feminist entitlement is the belief that women lying and manipulating is acceptable based solely on the nature of their gender.
This mentality carries with it a corresponding set of expectations about what women should provide for men.
This mentality carries with it a corresponding set of expectations about what men should provide for women.
It's a worldview that primarily defines women's social role as vessels of sexuality and men's roles as consumers or patrons of that sexuality.
It's a worldview that primarily defines men's social role as white knights and women's role as recipients of white knighting.
You're probably doing something right if you're being called a white knight.
Studied extensively. Unlike access to clean water or healthcare, which should be considered human rights that all people deserve simply for being human, access to a woman's affections, her body, or her sexuality is not a right owed to anyone except herself.
I guess it's a good thing these are fictional characters that don't want anything.
This should be obvious, but unfortunately, male entitlement is a pervasive problem in our culture today.
Feminist entitlement is also a pervasive problem. There are several women on your side that have been called out on their lies and manipulation who in turn hide behind their gender or harassment. Feminism won't solve the world's problems if feminists continue to be part of the problem.
The male entitlement mindset has a profound impact on how men relate to and interact with women. We see it manifest whenever a man orders a woman to show him her tits, or makes demands during an online game that a woman send him nude or sexual photos.
Feminist entitlement has a profound impact on how women relate to and interact with men. We see it manifest whenever a feminist asks for money because of harassment or insists that all forms of criticism are misogynistic or sexist in nature.
We see it in real-world spaces whenever men catcall women on the street. We see it whenever a man gropes a woman at an event or convention. We see it whenever a man expects sex in return for buying a woman dinner.
We see it in internet harassment when feminists instigate it. We see it whenever feminists post deliberately inflammatory tweets. We see it when a feminist expects money in response for crying harassment.
At its most serious, male entitlement is a mentality that serves as the foundation for the epidemics of date rape and sexual assault in our society.
At its most serious, feminist entitlement serves as the foundation for pushing propaganda filled with lies, manipulation, and lazy research.
Studied extensively. To be clear, this doesn't mean that every individual man consciously thinks that he has a right to the body of every individual woman he sees. Rather, male entitlement operates in the background of our culture.
To be clear, this doesn't mean that all feminists know they are liars and manipulators. Rather, feminist entitlement operates in the background of our culture.
It's a socially constructed mentality that's so deeply ingrained that it's often invisible, operating as an unquestioned base assumption.
Some feminist arguments are a socially constructed mentality that are so deeply ingrained that it's often invisible, operating as an unquestioned base assumption, such as much of the gender wage gap, which has been disproven, yet it's a base assumption it's still a problem in society as a whole. Many feminists, though, don't understand a lot of misinformation and manipulation is used to push the wage gap arguments. So to them, they don't understand they are actually spreading misinformation because that myth is so heavily ingrained in feminist thinking. Even if there is a wage gap in some areas of life, it's not as bad as we are led to believe in all areas of life.
The critical thing to remember here is that men are not born with this sense of entitlement. It's a learned way of thinking that shapes the ways men relate to women and women's bodies.
Just like feminists are not born with entitlement, it's a learned line of thinking from other feminists who are more interested in pushing ideology rather than reality.
This attitude is taught through a complex socialization process impacted by a whole host of factors. Families, religions, peer groups, movies, pop music, mainstream pornography, and video games can all play a part in the construction and perpetuation of this mentality.
I can make equally compelling arguments for modern feminism.
So of course video games on their own are not responsible for single-handedly creating male entitlement. However, because games are interactive systems, they can be programmed to reinforce male entitlement in some unique ways not found in other forms of media.
You haven't provided enough evidence video games are possibly more problematic because of their interactive nature, which is unique. That is why they are studying video games.
For instance, in Asura's Wrath, when the player stares at a maiden's breasts, she'll try to cover herself up. But if the player keeps staring, they will unlock an achievement called View of the Valley. Similarly, in Lollipop Chainsaw, the player can unlock the "I swear, I did it by mistake" achievement for for using the game camera to look up Juliet's skirt for an extended period of time, despite her coy efforts to block players from doing so. The Casanova achievement in the Saboteur can be unlocked for utilizing a mechanic in which players kiss 50 random women on the street without their consent as a form of camouflage to evade pursuing Nazis. Despite these troubling implications, game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy. It's most often meant as a lighthearted joke.
Anita, you make it too easy.
These achievements are directly rewarding players for in-game behavior that amounts to sexual harassment. Players are actively being encouraged to think of women's bodies as something they are entitled to interact with.
In video games, with fictional characters, and little evidence to suggest these sexual harassment behaviors carry over into the real world.
That fact in and of itself is troubling, but it's just another example of the core problem with the women as reward trope. Game systems are designed to provide feedback mechanisms that either punish or reward players for the ways they interact with virtual environments. Because video games are constructed around these formal input-output systems, they can be an especially powerful tool for reinforcing cognitive patterns by modeling and rewarding player behavior.
That's a great description implying things. Now go find me proof all those harmful effects are instilled in people through video games.
In a game, you're not just watching someone else being rewarded with a woman. You, the player, are earning a woman as a reward yourself for the actions you yourself have performed. Players make their correct inputs into the game. A woman's affection or her body is the corresponding output. Players go through the process of saving the princess, and the game's algorithm dutifully rewards them with what they think they are rightfully owed for doing so, whether it be a kiss, a girlfriend, or sexual attention. Social science indicates that one of the primary ways we learn about the world and our relationships to each other is through a process of observation and imitation. Human beings also learn by seeing something modeled for us, especially when the modeled actions are accompanied by rewards or punishments. Video games are uniquely positioned to provide experiences that do all of these things, because in most games, the player occupies both the role of participant and the role of spectator to their own actions.
Most people are aware video games are make-believe. Video games are also not studied enough to see how much more or less they affect us than other forms of media. If the study of video games was not necessary, they wouldn't do it.
In this way, the women as reward trope in video games becomes a mechanism through which male entitlement is taught and reinforced in our wider culture. Cognitively, it's strikingly similar to the expectation that if a man buys a woman a few drinks, then he's owed sex. The money and time for the alcohol and conversation are the inputs, the sexual gratification is the output.
You're comparing a real-world scenario to that of a game. Just because you do that in a game doesn't mean you behave that way in the real world. It's mostly implication on your part that this behavior carries over it to any significant degree, if any at all.
When men's entitlement-based expectations are not fulfilled, they sometimes lash out in resentment or aggression towards women. This is clearly illustrated in the catcalling scenarios I mentioned earlier. Street harassers feel entitled to women's time and women's attention. If they don't get the response they feel they're owed, they can become increasingly angry, following their targets, insulting them, groping them, or otherwise aggressively demanding to be acknowledged.
I just realized how much you're focusing on real-world situations. You do this in several of your videos. You hammer your arguments over and over, then slide in real-world harassment or tragedies that have nothing to do with video games.
In the gaming community, we see this entitlement-fueled outrage bubble to the surface when some gamers encounter indications that games aren't made exclusively with their fantasies in mind.
If this entitlement-fueled outrage exists in the real world and carries over into gaming culture, then it is a real-world problem that needs to be solved in the real world. Changing these games will not change the way some of these people behave.
Angry public temper tantrums from straight male players have occurred when role-playing games have forced them to interact with gay male characters, or presented them with lesbian characters who were not available as romance options to male avatars.
This is coming from a feminist whose video series is one big tantrum against straight male gamers. Do you understand how angry feminists can get over portrayals? Hate campaigns leveled out on Twitter over a single joke in a game. Look at the feminists you surround yourself with. You'd see nothing but a bunch of hypocrites. I don't support harassment or unjustified outrage from anyone, be them straight men or feminists.
Angry backlash from straight male players also materializes when Western releases of Japanese games place women in slightly less revealing outfits, or increase the age of young sexualized female characters to 18.
Angry backlash from feminists also materializes when women are placed in sexier outfits or do provocative poses in games,
which provide the perfect opportunity for her to contort her body into pornographic poses, including spreading her legs and doing a little flip in the air to kill the bad guys. When she lands, she does a little sexy pose for the player. In the same vein, when presented with critical analysis of the poor representations of women in many popular games, this intense male entitlement manifests in aggression, abuse, and threats. But I'm not really here to discuss the overly sexualized adolescent male fantasy that Bayonetta is, because it's basically a choose-your-own patriarchal adventure porno fantasy.
I don't support the abuse or threats you may have received, but some feminists have behavior similar to that of entitled men when they don't get their way. To assume this as a straight male-only issue is ignorant to what happens in the real world. Just because you don't abuse or threaten people doesn't mean other feminists don't do it.
As we've demonstrated in this episode, the women as reward trope is set up to fulfill a very specific male entitlement-oriented fantasy. In many cases, game creators may not even realize their mechanics are working to cement this mentality, but when games use a woman's affection, her body, or her sexuality as a carrot on a stick, they're actively encouraging men to think of women as objects, prizes, and status symbols.
Game creators may not even realize they are doing wrong, and that is under the assumption they even did anything wrong to begin with. I think some of your points would be worth discussing, but I'll never agree with everything you say about these games.
And it's not just men who are affected. This ideology of male entitlement seeps into the wider social consciousness of everyone, regardless of gender. A byproduct of which can negatively impact the ways women relate to one another and the ways we think about our relationships to our own bodies and our own sexuality.
The same can be said about feminism. It causes women to have issues with relating to other women, and I'd argue it also confuses women about their bodies and sexuality. Feminism teaches people that some things are a social construct. It's not natural. It's harmful for a woman to feel certain ways about her sexuality. Certain aspects of being a man are harmful, toxic masculinity as Macintosh calls it. Is it possible that feminists are also teaching toxic ideas? Because they define aspects of human nature as inherently bad and habitually shame you if you don't conform.
The good news is that because male entitlement is a learned attitude, it can, through education and conscious effort, be unlearned. And game systems are capable of being part of that transformative process.
The good news is that because aspects of feminism are a learned attitude,
I had to learn how to be a feminist. So not only did I have to learn how to be a feminist, I also had to learn how to be a feminist who understands systems.
it can, through education and conscious effort, be unlearned.
Just as our interactivity makes them a powerful tool for reinforcing male entitlement, so too could that interactivity be harnessed to disrupt antiquated gender dynamics and engage us with game mechanics that explore more equitable interactions between people of all genders.
Although Anita brings up some valid points, a lot of the stuff in these games could be summed up with one phrase.
It's most often meant as a lighthearted joke.
If you like this video, I have a playlist tackling Anita Sarkeesian and her work and encourage you to check it out. It also includes reviews of her Tropes vs. Women in video game series.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.
Oh, did I win?